In the final of sixth of these mini lectures, I want to look at the League of Nations. Now, I've talked a bit about the origins of the League of Nations back in 1919 at the Paris Peace Conference and going back into the First World War. What I want to look mainly at now is how the League of Nations actually panned out in the 1920s and 1930s and its subsequent history until it collapsed and was replaced by the United Nations in 1946. So remember, the starting point for the League of Nations, of course, you can't understand it unless you go back to the First World War. And the view of many people during the First World War, quite rightly, that this was a terrible tragedy. This showed that the whole system of doing international relations hadn't worked. If it could produce catastrophes and tragedies of this kind, you needed somehow to do things better. This is a view that has a lot of acceptance, particularly among people on the left and in the centre of British and American politics. And it's a view that's taken up particularly by the American President, Woodrow Wilson, who incorporates the League of Nations into his 14 points in 1918, and at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 insists on the League of Nations being established and written into the peace treaties. Now, Wilson knew that he wanted a League of Nations. He had not given much thought as to how it would actually work. And the League of Nations covenant that's actually drafted in 1919, with 26 articles, much of the detail is actually put in there by the British rather than by the Americans. The Americans wanted a league, but the structure of the league is decided by the British, and the structure is that there should be something called an assembly, which represents all members, a council, which represents the big powers, in the first instance the big allied powers, and thirdly something called the Secretariat, which is the official body under a secretary like the UN Secretary General that we have today that transacts the League's business. So the structure is largely decided by the British, and it's also the British who draft Articles 14 to 16, which are the core of the League of Nations covenant, which deal with how it's going to deal with threats to security and to peace. And essentially what the League does, the League covenant doesn't outlaw war, but it says that if two member states want to go to war, then they have to jump through a series of hoops. If there's a dispute between them, they have to put it to conciliation, or they have to put it to a court, to the Permanent Court of International Justice, to give a kind of legal ruling. If at the end of all of these processes they haven't reached a peaceful settlement, then they do have the right to go to war. But if they go to war without having followed through the processes beforehand, then the other member states can be directed by the Council to impose economic sanctions. And voluntarily they could also perhaps take military sanctions too, against countries that go to war without having exhausted peaceful means of resolving the dispute. So it's an attempt to, it doesn't outlaw war, but it's an attempt to make going to war much more difficult. Now, if we look at what happens after the League of Nations comes into being between 1920, if you like, there's a traditional view, which is the whole thing is a complete failure from the word go, and certainly it has great difficulties from the word go because of so many key states not belonging to it. The Soviet Union, the new state of communist Russia, had not been at the Paris Peace Conference, is not initially a member of the League and doesn't join it until 1934. The Americans, of course, had been at the Peace Conference, but the League of Nations becomes a hot political issue within the United States, not supported by President Woodrow Wilson's Republican critics, who feel that it commits America to too much. The American Senate doesn't ratify the Treaty of Versailles, and therefore America doesn't join the League of Nations. So the Americans and the Soviets are out from the start. Germany, as a defeated country, is excluded from the League, though admitted to it in 1926. So one of the key issues with the League is that a lot of countries don't belong to it. Now, having said all of that, during the 1920s, most historians would argue that the League of Nations is reasonably successful. It becomes a useful instrument because people can use it to as a mediating body in dealing with disputes. And there are a number of disputes where league mediation is successful, though they're all between small countries. For example, between Finland and Sweden, there's a dispute over the Åland Islands in the Baltic. The League gives a ruling and the Finns accept it. There's a dispute between Greece and Bulgaria. Greek troops occupy part of Bulgaria. The League asks them to leave, and they do. There's a dispute between the British Empire and what's now Iraq and Turkey over the area around Mosul in what's now northern Iraq. Again, the League gives a ruling that this should stay within what becomes Iraq, and the Turks accept that. So there are a number of disputes, if you like, where the League arbitration and intervention is successful. Also, the League has a good humanitarian role, for example, in looking after prisoners of war and refugees after a war between Greece and Turkey in 1919 to 1922. So it has a humanitarian role. It's also important that the League is just there, because before 1914, the nearest equivalent had been something called the Concert of Europe, which just represents the big powers in Europe, which doesn't meet continuously, and has much less, doesn't have a proper constitution, and is a much weaker and more informal body than the League had been, and had been unable to prevent the outbreak of war in 1914. So the League exists, it keeps going for several years, it has a humanitarian role, and it has a useful role for mediating in disputes between minor countries. But already as early as 1923, when it's challenged by a major country, which is Italy, Italy has a dispute with Greece, occupies the Greek island of Corfu. The League of Nations calls on the Italians to leave, and the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini refuses to do so. So even during the 1920s, the League can't act against a major power. And in the 1930s, once the League is challenged much more consistently by major powers, it quickly shows itself to be unable to deal with the problem. There are two key incidents here. One is the Manchurian crisis in 1931-33, and the second one is the Abyssinian crisis in 1935-36. In the first one, the Manchurian crisis, Japan, which had previously occupied southern Manchuria, which is in northern China, occupies the whole of Manchuria from September 1933 onwards. The League of Nations response is largely confined to a legal response of non-recognition. The League, and indeed the Americans too, who are out of the League, don't accept the legality of what Japan has done, but they don't proceed from that to taking actually economic sanctions, let alone military sanctions. And part of the reason for this is that it's actually a difficult thing for the League to cope with. The Japanese claim it's a police action. They don't declare war. So this is not like 1914. It's not the kind of scenario that the League have been prepared to deal with. And from the point of many League member states have sympathy with the Japanese against the Chinese. So effective action is not taken against the Japanese except for non-recognition of the puppet state that they establish in Manchuria. The real crucial point, the crisis that really destroys the League's authority, is the Abyssinian crisis, when Italy again, under Mussolini, invades Ethiopia in 1935 and invades and conquers it in 1935-36. This is a much more direct challenge to the League. It's much more clearly an act of aggression. Most League sympathies with member states have sympathy with Abyssinia. The Abyssinian president, Haile Selassie, comes and speaks to the League Assembly. Led by the British and French, the League this time does apply economic sanctions against Italy, and also some military steps. The Royal Navy in the Mediterranean, for example, is reinforced. But the end of all of this process is the Italians occupy Abyssinia. They conquer and defeat the Abyssinian armies, including using poison gas, and the Allied powers don't proceed to military measures, nor do they apply particularly effective economic sanctions. In particular, what they don't do is ever apply oil sanctions. They could have stopped the Italian invasion of Ethiopia by withholding oil deliveries, and they don't. So the key question, in a way, is to why the League powers, Britain and France, impose sanctions on Italy, but get the kind of worst of both worlds. They alienate Italy, so they can't cooperate with Italy against Hitler. On the other hand, they don't uphold the authority of the League of Nations. The key reason why the British and French don't uphold the League of Nations is that they were worried of getting into a war with Italy, which they thought that they could win, but would be a distraction against what they see as the real enemy, which is Germany and to some extent Japan. So the British and French are in a kind of halfway house where they go along with sanctions against Italy because British public opinion particularly is demanding that. On the other hand, they keep trying to buy the Italians off through backstairs secret diplomacy. And when this comes into the public domain, then there is an outcry. But it becomes clear the British and French support for the League is actually very half-hearted. So after 1936, the League continues to exist, but it really plays no role in the further crises in the run-up to the Second World War, such as the Munich crisis in 1938, and it keeps it going as a kind of shadow. So the League of Nations, coming in summary then, the League of Nations seems quite successful in the 1920s and up to the early 1930s. But as soon as it's really challenged, the key point really is the League of Nations itself has no power other than if the key member states aren't willing to support it. And the key League states, Britain and France, have good reasons in the 1930s for not supporting the League, because they do not want to alienate Japan and Italy. Their national interests, if you like, the British and French leaders, now cut against cooperating with the League.